So, welcome again to this afternoon's program, Healing from Hate, How the Power of Personal Transformation Can Elicit Collective Change. This program is co-sponsored by Initiatives of Change and the Richmond Hill Koinonia School of Race and Justice. We gather this afternoon with our city under a state of emergency in anticipation of possible violence connected with the gun rally scheduled for Monday, which, no coincidence, is also Martin Luther King's birthday. That rally is expected to draw white supremacists and other anti-government extremists. We also gather today with the memory of what happened in Charlottesville 3 years ago, still very clear in our minds. We also gather this afternoon to offer something different, to offer hope and the possibility that hate can be healed. It's our mission here at Richmond Hill to seek the healing of the metropolitan city. And we do that through prayer. We meet in this chapel 3 times a day to pray for the healing of the city, through the work of racial reconciliation, through spiritual development, and through the practice of offering hospitality. So with that in mind, we are pleased to be able to host this gathering today. Many of us in this room were at the Commonwealth Prayer Breakfast just a few days ago to start this year's General Assembly session. Keynote speaker, Chief Judge Roger Gregory told a story. He actually told several beautiful stories, and his words were quite inspiring. But one of his stories, I think, holds some particular relevance to this moment. It was the story of a little boy whose father's job was to light the gas lamps in the city. The story takes place years ago when that job was done manually. And his father would literally walk the streets lighting the gas lamps, and he would follow him as the dusk turned to night. And at one point, his teacher gathered the children, and they were doing an assembly, and they were talking about what their parents did for a living. And the class each took a turn, and when it finally got around to this little boy, he thought about his father, and he thought, well, he stood up and said, "My dad punches holes in the darkness. My dad punches holes in the darkness." That seems an apt description of the work that all of us have the opportunity to do. And certainly our 3 guests today are fitting examples of those who do that, those who punch holes in the darkness. And we look forward to hearing your stories soon. Before we do that, though, I want to offer a brief time of musical reflection as we center ourselves and prepare for this afternoon's program. To do that, I want to invite my friend Logan Jones to join me up front. Logan is a music leader in the community. He's also an experienced Enneagram teacher and coach. And he was on a retreat here just a day ago with our Ruah School of Spiritual Direction. And he told me, "I've learned this song, I'd like to teach it to you." And the song was written by a friend of his who lives in Charlottesville. And it was inspired by words of Martin Luther King, and in anticipation also of this weekend and our need for focus and prayer. The words that inspired this song are, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant." So you should have words to the song lyrics near your seat. If you don't, they're on the chairs near the doors, or you can look on with your neighbor. We're going to learn this. It's a very simple song. It has...
Invite everybody back now and into the program. I want to thank Joel and Richmond Hill for the gathering, the space. It's a sacred space, and it's a sacred conversation today with beautiful people that are sharing vulnerably their lives, their stories with us here in Richmond. So we're grateful for the moment and the presence that's here. I'm Jake Hirschman. I work with Initiatives of Change USA, and we are a group that's based here in Richmond. Our work is local, it's national, and it's international. We work a lot in narrative spaces. We talk in a narrative sense, in the intrapersonal sense, the the narratives, the stories, the principles that guide my decisions as an individual and my participation in community. We work a lot at the interpersonal level in the narratives that inform the way that we interact with one another and guide that in healthy and unhealthy ways. And we work even at a systems level, the narratives that have been sanctioned at a systems level in the past and give weight to policies and systems that harm people and harm communities even now. So our work, again, is global, it's national, and it's local, and there's a mutuality in all of that we try to unpack in the work that we do. Let me just tell you a little bit about how this gathering came to be. And we won't inundate you with details about all of that, but I think it's important to understand in light of Monday's rally and how these people came to be here with us in Richmond. The work that I just described was requested to be presented at a panel in September in Washington. It was a peace-building gathering of global organizations that work in the peace-building space, and I was sharing some of the work that we do. Jesse was on that panel. I started hearing about his bold work, and I thought that was pretty profound. And we started talking about how we could potentially network our networks together and do some collaborative work. Soon after, Jesse called me in early December and said, hey, there's going to be probably a rally in January. It could be 10 people with 10 counter-protesters, maybe more. We don't know. But what if we maybe present an alternative conversation to whatever that ends up looking like and share something about our stories, some of the allies that are part of that work, and see what happens. So we started kind of thinking about that and reached out to Richmond Hill, and Joel was interested in putting this together. And we're grateful that we did do that. Sometimes you got to just step out and see what happens. And we're pleased that there is an alternative space and conversation today and this weekend happening to unpack some of the complicated dynamics that maybe are part of our city right now and beyond. So I think it's important to just give you a sense of who these people are, but really depending on them to weave the tale of their stories and their lives and their work into the talks that they're going to give. So I withhold doing too much of that. Suffice it to say, they're an esteemed, profound group. Mimi Anderson Olive is a lifetime student of mindful living. She was born into a military family and has lived all over the world. But she spent much of her youth and her young adulthood in the Bay Area of San Francisco, where she really developed a passion for self-exploration and consciousness and mindful living. But she maintained her connections to a family legacy that not only included that military profile, but also the fact that her grandfather was a pioneer in the civil rights movement and was a mentor and associate of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That's Vernon Johns, who preceded Dr. King at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. Mimi has experience and insight into how to overcome conflict and how she's done that in her own life and has taken principled spiritual pathways to healing herself in order to more dutifully and impactfully serve other people. So we want to hear about that path, and she's come with a willingness and a vulnerability to share with us today, and we're grateful for that. Jesse Morton was once a prominent radicalizer in the West. He was a co-founder and chief propagandist of Revolution Muslim, which was a New York-based group active in the 2000s. He helped to insert the narrative of Al-Qaeda and Salafi jihadist ideology into the American ambit, into the vernacular of the West, into the culture of the West. And Jesse Morton, Mr. Morton, had direct contact with some of the most prominent extremist preachers in the West, including Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan. The organization that he co-founded, unfortunately, was connected to a number of terrorism cases. Jesse also had a profound and compelling life and story before the period I just mentioned, and he has had one subsequent to that as well. And so we hope to hear about all of that today. And finally, Daryl Davis graduated with a degree in jazz. He was also trained in music informally by legendary blues, boogie-woogie, and rock and roll pianist Pine Top Perkins and Johnny Johnson. Both of them claimed Darrell as their godson. Darrell's a pianist, a vocalist. He's also a professional actor, an author, a lecturer, and he's led his own Darrell Davis band. He's worked with Elvis Presley's Jordanaires, Chuck Berry for decades, the legendary blues band, Percy Sledge, Sam Moore, Nappy Brown, a multitude of others. In that capacity, Darrell was once playing, and a man afterwards told Darrell that he'd never seen a black man play piano like Jerry Lee Lewis. Darrell patiently and graciously explained to him that music was learned both from Jerry Lee Lewis and from him, from black blues and boogie-woogie pianists. The man evidently had a hard time believing that, but he became a fan of Darrell's and ultimately a friend, and it turns out that man was also a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Darrell is also a recipient of numerous awards for his music and his work in race relations. Very honored to have him here to come down from suburban DC. Just off a plane from Brussels, getting ready to get on a plane tomorrow morning early to New Hampshire. So he was gracious enough to come down with us. So that's who's on our panel. And we're interested to see how all of those stories blend together into hopefully a semi-coherent narrative today. And I think the format will be 15 minutes or so from each of them. Please, Darrell Davis.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, my journey into this foray of race relations started about 35 years ago. As Jake was saying, I'm a professional musician. I travel all over this country and around the world performing with my own band, excuse me, and with many other artists. But let's go back to where this first started. Back 51 years ago, when I was age 10, we had just moved to the city of Belmont, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. I'm from Chicago originally. My parents are from Virginia, Roanoke and Salem, respectively. But anyway, I was one of two black members in my entire school, kids in my entire school. I was age 10, 1968. So all of my friends were white. The other black schoolmate was a little girl in second grade. So I rarely saw her except for at recess or lunchtime in the cafeteria. So many of my guy friends were members of the Cub Scouts, and they invited me to join. I joined the Cub Scouts. I was the only black scout in the area. And we had a parade to commemorate the ride of Paul Revere from Lexington to Concord. And so the Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, Brownies, 4-H Club, and a lot of different organizations. Streets were blocked off, sidewalks were filled with nothing but white people cheering us, waving, and yelling the British are coming and all that kind of thing. So my den mother let me carry the American flag. And I'm marching with my fellow scouts. Everything's going along fine. And then at some point, down this parade route, I suddenly began getting hit with bottles, rocks, soda pop cans, and debris from the street by a small group of white spectators mixed in with the larger crowd over to my right on the sidewalk. And I remember it being a couple of kids and a couple of adults, maybe 5 people in total. And I assume these kids, these adults were these kids' parents. They all were throwing things. And having never had any kind of precedent for this, my first inclination was, oh, those people over there don't like the Scouts. I didn't know any better. It wasn't until my den mother, my cub master, my troop leader all came running and huddled over me with their bodies and escorted me out of the danger that I realized I was the only person getting targeted. But I still didn't know why. I hadn't done anything. And I kept saying, why are they hitting me? Why are they hitting me? I didn't do anything. All they would say is, shh, move along, Darrell, move along, hurry up, it'll be okay. And, you know, at 10 years old, if you have a question, you must have an answer. And if you don't have an answer, you begin creating your own answers to placate your curiosity. I hadn't said anything to these people. I had done absolutely nothing. And so I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's because I'm the new kid on the block. I've only been there a couple months. And I had every excuse but the right excuse. When I got home, my mom and dad, who were not at the march, were asking me, putting the Curachrome on me and Band-Aids, and asking me, how did you fall down and get all scraped up? I told them I didn't fall down. I told them exactly what had happened. For the first time in my life, my mother and father sat me down and explained to me what racism was. And believe it or not, at the age of 10, I had never heard the word racism. I had no idea what they were talking about, none. And my 10-year-old brain could not wrap itself around the idea that someone who had never laid eyes on me, never spoken to me, knew absolutely nothing about me, would want to inflict pain upon me for no other reason than the color of my skin. It made absolutely no sense. Now, my parents had never lied to me. They'd always told me the truth. I didn't have big brothers and sisters to learn things from. I'm the only child. My folks got it right the first time. So, I relied on my folks. My folks always told me the truth. If I had a question, a problem, they gave me the answers or the solution, or they gave me the tools by which I could derive the answers and solutions. But on this day, in 1968, when they told me why this was happening, I literally, for the first time in my life, thought my parents were lying to me. I couldn't believe it. Because I'd been around white people, all kinds of people, all my life, and this had never happened. And those people over here did not look any different than my friends at school, or their parents, or whoever. And they didn't treat me like that. So for some reason that was hidden to me, my parents were pulling my leg. I didn't believe them. Well, about a month and a half or so later, that same year, on April the 4th, 1968, I remember it very well, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And every major city in this country, including right here, Richmond, Virginia, my hometown, Chicago, Boston, nearby Boston, Washington, D.C., New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, Los Angeles, Nashville, every major city burned to the ground with destruction and violence, all in the name of this new word that I had learned called racism. So now I understood. My parents had not lied to me. But this thing called racism does exist. I realized that. But what I didn't understand was why? Why? And I formed a question in my mind at that age. And that question was, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And for the next 51 years, I've been looking for the answer to that question. As a teenager and young adult, I bought books on black supremacy, on white supremacy, on the Nazis in Germany, the neo-Nazis over here, the Ku Klux Klan, you name it. I wanted to understand where that ideology comes from. I knew you're not born with it, so where do you acquire it? Where is it going? How can it be addressed? None of my books answered those questions. They all talked about it, but they did not give me any concrete answer. And nobody could answer the question for me. They said, well, Darryl, some people are just like that. Yeah, but why? Well, that's just the way it is. No, I need an answer. I need a reason. So I did not accept that. Well, skipping ahead, I graduated college with my degree in music from Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I began playing professionally. I joined a country band. And I love jazz and blues. Country music is no different. It's a kissing cousin to the blues. Same three chords. And, country music had made a resurgence. There'd been a movie out called Urban Cowboy. And all of a sudden, every bar in the country went country. So if you wanted to work full-time in music, you played country. And I like country music. So I joined this country band. I'm the only black guy in the band, and usually the only black guy wherever we played. Well, we played a bar up in Frederick, Maryland. And it was called the Silver Dollar Lounge. Now, the band had already played there many times. I just joined the band. This was an all-white bar. And when I say all white, I don't mean that black people could not go in there. What I mean is that black people did not go in there, and that was by their own choice. And it was a good choice, because they were not welcome. Well, here I was in the Silver Dollar Lounge, and I looked at that bottle of water that I saw. Oh, thank you. Thank you. And so here I was in the Silver Dollar Lounge, and everything was going along fine. Came off the bandstand on break after the first set, and I'm walking with the band, they're ahead of me, to the table, take a break. And I feel somebody put their arm around my shoulder. I turn around to see who's touching me, because I saw the whole band up ahead of me, and I didn't know anybody in the Silver Dollar Lounge. And it was a white gentleman, maybe 15, 18 years older than me. And he says, "Man, I really like your all's music." I said, "Thank you." I shook his hand, and he pointed at the stage, and he said, "I've seen this here band before, but I had never seen you before. Where'd you come from?" And I explained, "Well, yeah, you probably did see them. They have been here before, but I just joined the band. It's my first time here." He goes, "Well, man, I sure like your piano playing. This is the first time I ever heard a black man play piano like Jerry Lee Lewis." So I'm thinking, where's this guy coming from? Has he never seen Little Richard or Fats Domino? And I said, I wasn't trying to be facetious, but I was kind of taken aback. And I said, "Well, where do you think Jerry Lee Lewis learned how to play?" I'm thinking, this guy's older than me. Certainly he has to know the history of Jerry Lee's style of piano playing. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, he learned from the same place I did, from black, blues, and boogie-woogie piano players. That's where rockabilly and rock and roll came from." "Oh, no. Jerry Lee invented that. I ain't never seen no black man play like that, except for you." I told him, I said, "Look, man," I said, "I know Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis is a very good friend of mine. He has told me himself where he learned how to play." The guy did not buy that I knew Jerry Lee. He didn't buy that Jerry Lee learned anything from black people. But he was fascinated with me, and he wanted to buy me a drink. Now, I don't drink, but I went back to his table and had a cranberry juice. He paid the waitress. He takes his glass, and he clinks my glass, and cheers me. And then he says, "This is the first time I ever sat down and had a drink with a black man." Now, I'm really curious, because at that point in my life, I had sat down with thousands of white people or anybody else and had a meal, a beverage, a conversation. How is it that this man, who's 15, 18 years older than me, had never sat down before with a black guy? And I know that there are black people in Frederick, Maryland. I know that for a fact, because I've seen them. So how is it that he has somehow missed them? Well, I said, "Why?" He looked at the tabletop. He didn't answer me. I asked him again. He didn't answer me. His buddy sitting next to him said, "Tell him." I said, "Tell me." He looked back at me just as plain as day and said, "I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan." Well, I burst out laughing, because now I didn't believe him. Okay? I know a lot about the Klan. I have just about every book written on the Klan, literally. I have a vast library on it. And I know the Klan does not just come around and hug black people and want to, hang out with them, buy them a drink, and praise their piano playing or whatever. So I said, okay, this guy's jerking me around because he thinks I'm jerking him around about Jerry Lee. So I'm laughing. He goes inside his pocket, pulls out his wallet, and hands me his Klan membership card. I look at this thing, whoa. I recognize the Ku Klux Klan insignia, which is a red circle with a white cross and a red blood drop in the center. So, oh, this thing is for real. So I stopped laughing. It wasn't funny then. And I gave it back to him. And we talked about the Klan and some other things. And he gave me his number and wanted me to call him whenever I was to return to this bar, because he wanted to bring his friends, to see Klansmen and Klanswomen, to see this black guy play like Jerry Lee. So I would call him every 6 weeks whenever we were back at the bar and say, hey man, we're coming down to Silver Dollar this week and come on out. He'd come, he'd bring Klansmen and Klanswomen with him, and they'd watch me play, get out there on the dance floor and dance. And on the break, I'd go to his table and say hello. Some of them wanted to meet me, so they'd hang around. Others would see me coming, and they'd get up and take off and go to some other part of the room, where they didn't have to deal with me, which was fine. And then shortly thereafter, I quit that band and at the end of the year and went back to playing rock and roll and R&B and whatever else was going on. And I lost track of the guy. But then it dawned, it wasn't like I had a day off and I went to Frederick to hang out with the Klan. I moved on. So it dawned on me some time later, Darryl, the answer to your question that's been plaguing you since you were 10 years old, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? The answer fell into your lap and you didn't even realize it. Who better to ask than someone who would go so far as to join an organization which has over 100-year history of practicing hating people who do not look like them and who don't believe as they believe. You need to get back in contact with that guy and have him set you up with the Klan leader here in Maryland. In fact, you need to write a book. Maybe start with the Klan leader here in Maryland, go up north, go down south, go to the Midwest, go to the West, and interview Klan leaders and Klan members and find out the answer to your question. So essentially, that's what I did. Skipping ahead, my book became the first book written by a black author who went around the country interviewing KKK leaders and members. As a result of my doing that, many of these people that I interviewed, leaders and members alike, began dropping out of the Klan because I wasn't there doing combat. I was there listening to their stories. Everybody wants to be heard. And when I would ask that question, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? Some of the answers I would get are, this is within 10 minutes of my meeting, some Klan person that I'm interviewing would tell me, black people are criminals. That's why there are more blacks in prison than there are whites. Black people are lazy. We don't want to work. We prefer to scam the government welfare system. Black people have smaller brains than white people. Now when you hear that, is it offensive what they're saying? Absolutely it's offensive. Am I offended by it? Absolutely not. And the reason why I'm not offended is because why should I be offended by a lie? This person just met me 5 or 10 minutes ago, and they're going to tell me who I am just by looking at my skin color? Why should I be offended? So I just let them talk. But see, they're not used to that. They're used to getting it on, combating, pushing buttons. So if I were to attack them for it, then all I'm doing is empowering them and giving credibility to what they already believe, because one's perception is one's reality. So I just listened to them, and then at the end I said, look, you know what? I don't have a criminal record. I've never been on welfare. I've never measured my brain, but I'm sure it's the same size as anybody else's. Okay? Sure, there are more black people in prison than there are white people, but that's not because we're criminals, it's because of a broken judicial system. So, they see the result, but they don't see the reason behind it. Okay, so anyway, over these 35 years, I got invited to, and I still go, I'm still doing it. I got invited to many, many Klan rallies where I go watch them parade around this big cross and set it on fire and give all these racist and supremacist type speeches and things like that. But one by one, these people that I would talk to, we would develop a relationship. We start here. They're here and I'm here in terms of our ideological beliefs. But what you do is you find common ground. You plant a seed and you nourish that seed and you find a couple commonalities. The next thing you know, as you find commonalities, you're growing closer. When you get about here, you have created a relationship. That seed has blossomed into a relationship. So you began nurturing that relationship and you become closer and closer. And you find more commonalities. When you get here, you have developed a friendship. And by the time you reach there, the trivial things that you have in contrast, such as skin color, or whether you go to a church, a synagogue, a mosque, or temple, begin to matter less and less. And then ideologies begin changing. I have a ton of Klan robes and Klan hoods and neo-Nazi flags and Klan flags at home that have been given to me by active members who have renounced that ideology. I find that in our country, we spend way too much time talking about the other person, or talking at the other person, or talking past the other person. Why don't we spend a little bit of time talking with the other person? Now, I'm not so naive as to believe that everybody is going to change. No. There'll be people on all sides who will go to their graves being hateful, violent, and racist. And there's no changing them. But if somebody is with those beliefs is willing to sit down and talk with you and have a conversation, there is an opportunity to plant a seed. Because remember, this ideology is a learned ideology. Anything that can be learned can be unlearned. It might take a little bit of time, but it can be done. Now, I'll just conclude by saying this. You know, what we saw 3 years ago in Charlottesville, and I know all those people, I know the people personally who put together that rally, and the speakers there. I know them all. And the mayhem that came with that, you know, you may think, oh, you know, well, that's Charlottesville, you know, it's not Richmond. Yes, it is Richmond. It's New York, it's Chicago, it's Boise, Idaho. Anywhere where there's hate, these things can happen. And don't think it's not my city. If you are an American, every city in this country is your city. Okay, what happened in New York, 9/11, belongs to Los Angeles out there too. This whole country is our country, all right? Our country, our society can only become one of two things. One, it can become that which we sit back and let it become, or it can become two, that which we stand up and make it. So you have to ask yourselves the question, do I want to sit back and see what my society becomes? Or do I want to stand up and make my society become what I want to see? That's a question only you can answer. So I've chosen the latter, and I do that by engaging with people who share a different ideology than I do. And I do it by talking with them, not at them, not past them, and not about them. It pains me, you know, we call ourselves the greatest nation on the face of this earth. Don't get me wrong, I'm patriotic and love my country. But I do have some problems with that statement. You know, we put a man on the moon. And while Neil Armstrong was up there walking around talking about one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind, we were able to talk to him via satellite radio phone, live from right here on Earth, all the way to the moon. We invented that technology. Everybody in this room has email. Everybody in here has a cell phone. Hit a few numbers, hit a few words, talk to somebody right next door in West Virginia or California, Africa, China, Europe, Australia, Asia. We invented that technology. Perhaps we are the greatest technological country in the world. All right? But how is it that we as Americans can talk to people as far away as the moon or anywhere on the face of this earth, and yet we have difficulty talking to the person who lives right next door because he or she is a different color, a different religion, a different persuasion, a different ethnicity? It seems to me that before we can call ourselves the greatest, our ideology needs to catch up to our technology. When we get them both up there, then we can truly brag about how great we are. Folks, we are living in the 21st century. Why is this stuff still going on in the 21st century? We are living in space age times, so why are we still thinking with Stone Age minds? And only we can change that. Now, I don't recall what song I was playing with the band, you know, a couple of decades ago when the Klansmen came up and approached me. But I do remember the style that I was playing. And like I said, boogie woogie, rock and roll, rockabilly, whatever you want to call it. I would play that style behind Chuck Berry. I worked with Chuck Berry for 32 years, the man who invented rock and roll. So while he's playing Johnny B. Good and duck walking, I'm playing the piano like this. So I'll give you a little demonstration of the style. That's what got the Klansman up from his table, come over and hug me. Music is a common denominator. Everybody likes music, even the Klan. So, this is the music that was created by Black American blues and boogie woogie piano players. Went on to become rock and roll.
So we're going to flip the script just a little bit so Daryl can make it out safely up to Northern Virginia and DC area. So maybe if a couple questions that people have specifically for Daryl when he just talked about his life, then we can ask those now. He can explain some things and then head out. Any questions for Daryl? Yes, ma'am.
What's the name of your book?
The name of the book is called Clandestine, spelled with a K, not a C. Clandestine Relationships. And it came out in 97, 98. It's out of print now, but I'm working on the second edition, which will have all the stuff from the old, plus updates and new stuff, which should come out this year.
Were you not interviewed on PBS? I've heard this story
Yes.
before. Yes.
Yes.
Great job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, just one more question. You talk about that relationship, that one-on-one engagement. What systematically do you see us doing as individuals also in addition to that? You've seen progress towards understanding and peace.
Realizing, that regardless of where somebody comes from, their station in life, their background, at the end of the day, we all are human beings. And oftentimes we tend, you look like Robert Redford. But I know you've heard that before. But you know, we tend to self-segregate. You know, you walk into a cafeteria, you know, blacks sit with blacks, Hispanics with Hispanics, and all that kind of stuff, because we tend to feel more comfortable around people who may look like us, share the same language, same culture, etc. But you know, and that's fine. But you know, if you go too far, then it becomes a separatist, supremacist kind of thing. So I would, you know, suggest to people in schools, in office buildings, walk across the cafeteria and sit with somebody else a couple times a week, because you have something to teach them and you have something to learn from them. And it makes you a more well-rounded person. It's a win-win situation for everybody.
All right, we got 3 questions. Start here, and then we'll go to the last 2 again.
Daryl, I so admire you, and I hope you know that. You know that with my family in particular, because I come from a family of Holocaust survivors, there is a lot of paranoia and trauma that we're still very much working through. And in my generation, I feel, as you know, I work in this realm. I extend the olive leaf out. But for my, for my stepfather and his whole family and my mother, that's I feel like that is very, very difficult for them to wrap their heads around that, for what they've gone through. What advice would you give in situations like this, with families like this? Like, how do we heal enough to be able to extend the olive branch out?
We never forget the things that have happened, but we also realize unless we become the change we want to see, those things will never change, and they're apt to repeat themselves. You know, we're celebrating Martin Luther King day after tomorrow. His actual birthday was the day before yesterday, or the 15th. But just to paraphrase, one of his greatest speeches was the I Have a Dream speech. And one of his dreams in there, that I'm going to paraphrase, was he said something to the effect of, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves will sit down at the table of brotherhood with the sons of former slave owners. You know, and that's the dream that I'm trying to make become reality, to sit down with those people, because that's what affects change. You know, the change is on us. Our parents went through a lot of stuff so that we could be here. And, you know, they've done enough. It's on us now to make those changes. Just like if my parents and their generation had not done the things that they did with my dad marched with Dr. King, okay? I would still be riding in the back of the bus and drinking from a separate water fountain and all these things. So it's incumbent upon us to see that future generations get better and better. I certainly understand where your parents are coming from, no question about it. I have a friend, and I think you might even know her, who has an organization. Well, it's not her organization, but she belongs to it. She's a Jewish lady in Potomac, Maryland, who belongs to this organization that brings together the children of German Nazis with the children of Holocaust survivors. Very, very powerful. And see, we need more of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yes.
Hello. Wonderful work that you're doing. I'm involved with a group called Coming to the Table. And with that, the quote that you just did from Martin Luther King is part of what we adopt. Mm-hmm. Yes. And so my question is, so we facilitate conversations between blacks and white in hopes of coming to conciliation. And so my question to you is that, wow, so in talking to the Klans people and stuff, had the conversations at any time gotten a little less than pleasant? We have like.
Have they ever gone awry?
Because I know we have touchstones and things that we have in place to kind of like facilitate the conversations that we have. I'm thinking you are possibly by yourself while you're having these conversations with people that invited you there, but maybe not everyone, so I'm just asking, right? Have some of the questions I've gotten just a tad bit
Yes,
awry.
I have a defense system that serves me very well. I'm very well protected, and my defense system is the Lord above. I do go by myself, and I go unarmed.
Lady in the red had a question.
Hi.
Okay, that was one of the questions, but the other question I have is, as you travel around speaking, because I know in your work you have, or your conversation is pretty much with extremists who hate the hatred itself. But how often do you have more diverse, do you have conversations with people that look like me? You know, black people who may not know how to engage in those conversations or don't feel comfortable. I know coming to the table is a great space, but there's some people who don't know how to have that conversation. So I was just wondering about the audiences that you have around the country, around the world. And also, I saw a movie called Skin. And Skin actually deals with, the combination between what the work you do and this something of what Jesse brings to the table.
Right.
So I was
Filmmaker friend of mine.
Okay, so I was wondering if that film was based on you and your life at all. So.
But some of the people in the movie that she interviewed, okay, I have their robes now.
Oh, wow.
But to also answer your other question, I speak to people who bring me in. There are plenty of black people who agree with what I do, and there are plenty who do not agree. They can't accept sitting down with someone who hated them and having a conversation. But hatred begets hatred. So as Martin King said, the only thing that can drive out hatred is love. Drive out darkness is light. So it's incumbent. And people say, why should I be responsible for teaching white people how to treat us like human beings? We all are responsible for each other. Right? If I have something that you don't have, then I should share it with you. If you have something that I don't have, share it with me. Let's stop saying I'm not my brother's keeper. We are our brothers and sisters' keeper. We all are Americans, we're all human beings, and that is what will strengthen us. This country was built upon diversity. Let's not forget that. And so that's what we need to carry forth.
So one more question, and Daryl actually does have a movie about him, though.
It's called Accidental Courtesy. And you will see some of the very same thing you're talking about in that movie. I intentionally had that left in. So you'll see that racism has many facets.
Sir?
After August 12th, a longtime friend of yours, Richard Preston, fired a gun at Corey Long. He yelled "die" and followed by a racial slur. And you spoke during his sentencing saying that
That's correct.
He needed more time to confront his racism and heal. But at what point would you say that somebody no longer has any light that can come into their heart, and that they're someone that you have to write off, that there's nothing that you can't help them, they won't accept your help, that they're not working in good faith? At what point would you do that?
The point is at different places with different people. Richard Preston does have a heart. I know that. I know Richard very well. Okay. In fact, did you find the after story of that? What this gentleman was talking about is at the Charlottesville rally, where James Fields, the white supremacist, drove his car through the crowd and murdered a young lady named Heather Heyer. Another incident that took place there was a black gentleman named Corey Long had an improvised flamethrower, and he was shooting a flame.
Sir, I must interject. He did not have an improvised flamethrower. He had an aerosol can and a lighter. He was next to a gentleman who was getting hit with a staff pole. And Jesse, you're shaking your head. This is not. This is very important distinction. These are talking points from the Klansmen that were hurting people. So to say that he had an improvised flamethrower is harming the gentleman who was attacked at that moment.
All right, excuse me 1 second. First of all, it was an improvised flamethrower. And let me tell you why. I heard your reason. Okay? I know what a real flamethrower is, and so do you. But when you take an aerosol can and a match and you spray it, you are improvising a flamethrower. It's not one you go and buy in the store. It's an improvised flamethrower, okay? He was shooting a flame at these Klansmen who were trying to hit him with a Confederate flagpole. I'm not putting blame on anybody here. Richard Preston turned around, saw that, pulled out a gun. Richard Preston was the imperial wizard of this particular Klan group, one of them. Pulled out a gun and pointed it at the black gentleman's head and said, "Die, nigger," and then lowered the gun and fired it. And the bullet went into the ground next to his feet. And the Charlottesville police were standing right there and did absolutely nothing. And that incident, along with many other incidents that day, is what caused the chief of Charlottesville Police Department to be fired. Today, Charlottesville has a new police chief, which is what they need. All right, so I testified at Richard Spencer's trial, as he was pointing out. I told the judge that I wanted to meet with Richard Spencer and take him, Richard Preston. Richard Spencer was one of the speakers down there. Anyway, take him down to the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. I called Richard Preston after this incident and said, "Hey man, you and I need to talk. Not Klansman to black man, but man to man. Your Confederate history is as much a part of my history as my black history is a part of yours. Let's get together and explore American history together." He said, "Okay." So he gave me directions, we set a date. I drove to his house. I sat in his living room with his translating fiance, and I listened to him give me a lesson in American history for 2 hours. His living room was filled with Confederate stuff, KKK stuff, and I sat down and listened to him give me an American history lesson from a Confederate perspective, of course. At the end, I corrected him on some things that he got wrong, some things he got right, some things he got wrong. I corrected him. When it was my turn to impart what I knew, I said, "Here's what I want to do. I want you to come down to my house. I have some connections at the museum. Let's you and I and your translating fiance tour the museum together." And that's what we did. And as a result of that, when Richard Preston got married, he invited me to his wedding. Not only was I the only black person at the wedding, I was the only non-Klan person at the wedding. And his bride is from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Her father was too ill to come all the way up here to walk his daughter down the aisle. Richard Preston and his bride asked me if I would do it. And I walked her down the aisle and gave her away. And now they are married, and I'm the one who signed the witness thing on their marriage. Richard Preston still has a little ways to go, but he is now going in the right direction, and that's what's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Darryl. Appreciate it.
And I'm good.
Daryl, you out here to read 15, so. Yes. Yes. Thanks for your patience with some of the transitions, and very grateful again that Daryl came all the way down for a couple of hours and dealt with 95, which is not always humane. Again, Mimi Anderson Olive, and I shared a little bit about her, but she's going to come and grace us with her story and her learning. And please, I don't know if you care to sit or prefer to stand. All right.
So I'm asking myself why I'm standing here, and it's Jessie, and I'm really here because I feel that any one of you could be standing here and telling your story. And I feel so importantly that it's time that we all share our stories, because we tend to stand within ourselves and we think that our story is so small that it doesn't matter. And yet it's the collective work in each of our stories coming together that is what makes the difference. So Daryl's a hard act to follow. For someone who's never stood on stage and shared her very personal story. But I'm gonna start with a little bit of background history, because it really speaks to who I am and how I ended up here. So Jake told you a little bit about, and in this area you probably know him, my grandfather. My mother's father was Reverend Logan Jones, and he's from Prince Edward County, and he was a scholar and a very brilliant theologian. He was self-taught, he was a farm boy, and he taught himself to read Greek, Latin behind a plow. And he talked his way into Oberlin Seminary School, and he was a very self-made man. He was very good friends with Martin Luther King Sr. And so my mother grew up with Martin Luther King Jr. at the kitchen table. And this had a very profound effect on me, because all the people in the civil rights movement were therefore demystified for me. Martin Luther King Jr. is such a deity almost in our society. But the stories I heard about him, he was just a young man like my mom, living his life. And my grandfather was a very brilliant man, but also a very temperamental man. And I honestly believe that it was his anger that kept him from being able to continue with the civil rights work. And the beauty of knowing that is that everybody has their part to play, because the message that he imparted to his mentor, Martin Luther King Jr., took that message, coupled with what he had studied about Mahatma Gandhi. In their era, they called him the Mahatma. And he realized that the only way to approach hate is with love. But not this sort of weak love that some people feel, not a namby-pamby sort of, but a true sense of we are all a part of the planet. You don't have to believe in God, but certainly I do believe that the idea that God is in each and every one of us is a part of that, because if you don't have that sense of grounding that you are someone, that you are a part of God, that we are therefore all a collective, then you don't have the strength to combat what is coming towards you. So what happened for me was that my mother would tell the stories about growing up in Farmville, Virginia, in the segregated South, and not being able to drink from the water fountain and not being able to swim in the pool. And she told me the more horrifying stories about the Ku Klux Klan coming after her father because he was fighting for equal rights. He was very much about economic equality for blacks in the area. And he would say, if you see a good fight, get in it. And what he meant by that was, if you see a just cause, then you must understand, if you see the injustice, then you're part of the answer. And so that was very much the culture in which I was raised, and yet I was raised very far from the United States and the racial discord that was going on. So my mother went to Spelman College, and she met my father, who was a Morehouse man. And my father went to dental school. He wanted to be an architect, but you couldn't be an architect as a black man in that day because nobody's going to go to you. And so they told him dental school was the way to go. And at that time, there was a program, and he got his degree at Howard University, but it was a government program, and you gave them 4 years of military service, and they paid for your degree. And so my father ended up loving the military. He became a captain in the Navy, a dental officer. And so I was born in North Kingston, Rhode Island, very white part of the country. And then we went to Japan when I was a young girl. I was 15 months old. And at that time in the military, if you were an officer, you had to have house staff which was very uncomfortable for my mother, who did not come from a world of having staff. And so our house staff, Hisako-san, basically became my nanny. And so from a very young age, I was in a culture where no one looked like me, and all of the love and the attention that I received from Hisako-san was from a woman who was not a black woman. And then from there, we went to California, and we went out to UC Berkeley. My father was getting a second degree. He got a master's degree in public health. And so my parents took us out to an area where the public transportation had not yet come. And so I was in an area that was all white, and similar to Daryl's story, I was with people who had literally never seen a black person. And I have 2 older sisters, so it was me and my sisters, but I was younger. I was the only one in elementary school. And so from the age of 5, I was again looking out on a world that did not look at all like me, and people who would come up and say, "Can I just touch you? Oh my God, it doesn't rub off." And so this concept for me was one of true ignorance. So when there's true ignorance, you become the teacher. And because of all the teachings from my mother and my grandfather and my father as we would sit around the dinner table, I really grew up believing that it was my job to meet people and let them know that whatever belief that they think they have about black people is not who I am. I'm going to get to know them, and I'm going to show them who I am. And what I find very similar in my story and Daryl's was there was always this understanding that we are all one. There was always a belief in my innate sense of personal power. And because I knew myself, because I knew I was loved, because I knew I had been loved deeply by people of other colors, no one's hatred towards me could be accepted by me. And so from a very young age, my attitude was such that I would think, well, once they get to know me, they're gonna love me, right? And so I'll never forget one night my dad had a big party. You have to have a certain number of parties as a military officer. And as you know, everything with the military is very much protocol. And because in the Navy, being a captain is the second highest rank, he was very high up. And there was younger people, younger officers, non-officers at our house. And there was a young white man who was in his 20s, and I was probably about 8 years old. And I had a little short afro, and my son is 13. I look just like my son looks now. And we were standing in formation. My father was introducing us, and everybody was coming down the line at the front door, coming into our house. And he said hello to my sister and then to my next sister. And then he said, "Oh, and this must be your son." And my father said very graciously, no, this is my youngest daughter, Millicent. And I'll never forget looking at this man, and he was so mortified. He was so scared because he'd made such a faux pas in front of the captain who could have him demoted. And it was my first experience of understanding that a person's sense of their personal power has a lot to do with what they put out in the world and what they will receive from the world. And at that same time, I had a next door neighbor and we became very good friends. And one day she came out on the grass and she said to me, "I can't play with you anymore." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "My grandfather says I can't play with niggers." And she lived in her grandfather's house. She and her mother lived in the house. And she wiped her booger on me. Really gross act, right? But when she did it, I could see that duality in her. I could see the conflict of her wanting to take her grandfather's teachings and put something ugly out into the world. But at the same time, she knew that we had a friendship. She knew something different about me. She didn't really hate me. And I could see the dichotomy and the falseness in what she was doing. And I said to her, I know you didn't mean that. And I said, I had a lot of compassion. I said, I'm really sorry that you have to live under your grandfather's hatred, but one day you'll be healed and you'll live your own life, you'll make your own choices, and you already know you can have any friend of any color you want. And then I never talked to her again. But I think often about who she did become, because Daryl had such a point about crossing that line and talking to people who are not like you, of giving them a presentation of something that they have no knowledge of, and how much that little seed of something true makes a difference in their thinking. So fast forward a little bit, and I'm a young woman and I'm working in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is definitely the dawning of the age of Aquarius. There is a whole new thought movement, and I was a big part of that. And we marched for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and all through the years, my mother was very socially active. And when she was a young girl, her cousin Barbara came to the house, and she said to my grandfather, I don't know what to do. It's like, it's horrible at this school. We don't have any new books. The fire doesn't work. The building is freezing, and I don't want to go to school there anymore. And my grandfather, her uncle, said to her, well, Barbara, what are you going to do about it? And she was 16. And he said, you know what I always say, if you see the problem, it's your job to fix it. So what are you going to do about it? So she organized with her classmates a walkout, and you know this story. And that walkout ended up becoming one of the 3 cases in Brown versus the Board of Education that desegregated all the schools in the United States. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, Cousin Barbara had a plaque put up here in Richmond at Virginia State House. And again, what that made me realize at a young age is that when you're just someone living your life, thinking that these big issues are coming down upon you, you have to stop and realize that you are the change, and that you can gather together with others, and that you can make a difference. And so I was always finding a fight to get in, right? So I was a part of the LGBTQ movement in that area. And then I moved on into working with people who had experienced trauma. And this happened because a girlfriend of mine said, I want to open a business with you. And I said, well, why don't we do something that we really love and something good will surely follow. And the thing that I was studying at the time was angel energy. And so I was reading lots of like Christian and theological concepts about angels and sort of the New Age movement. And so we opened an angel gallery, and it was a retail gallery. It was just very fun. We brought in all artisans from the area, and they were all artisans who felt that they were being inspired by a muse. They weren't necessarily Christian. Some of them were atheists, but they all felt that there was some deeper calling within them that drew them to, and so we had all sorts of artifacts. We did paintings, and we had jewelry, and we had books, and we had candles, and we had clothes, and then we started doing workshops in the evening. A lot of the authors that were speaking came through Hay House, and they would want to come speak, and they would do their healing workshops. And what fascinated me was how much people who have experienced trauma in their personal lives are drawn to a healing in a spiritual way. And so from that, we started doing these healing workshops. And when I moved out here to DC, I started working with my friend Lisa Hamilton, who is Jewish, and I was dating a Jewish man, and we would go to the Jewish community centers, and we would set up meetings where the Holocaust survivors were speaking to the young generation about what had happened, and the power of those personal stories of the hope and the inspiration and that will to just survive that kept carrying them through was so inspiring to me. And we would sit, Lisa and I, we would talk about this when we were in the lunchroom at the Academy of Sciences where I worked. And then Lisa introduced me to Jesse recently. And Jesse is working now on a center that deals with trauma. And I'll let Jesse tell his own story, but it is really bringing a personal healing to individuals who have experienced trauma at a very young age. And through that individual healing and that sense of self-love, what then becomes possible, and everything becomes possible. So when you're thinking of yourself and you're thinking of this idea that I'm waiting for the more educated people, I'm waiting for the politicians to do something, I'm waiting for someone outside of me to be that answer, I'm really just here to say that each and every one of us, we're part of that answer, and we definitely need to be working together right now.
Thank you, Mary. Some questions for Mimi at the end after Jesse talks so that we can kind of cover that together, and if that's okay.
Sure.
And Jesse, well, he's going to tell you about his story, but I failed to mention that he has an organization that's new and is actually leading a lot of the systemic work in this space that not many others are a part of. But that's something he's hoping to change, and the visit to Richmond and the work in Richmond is a part of that going forward. So please, Jesse Morton.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Joel and Jake for helping us to organize this. It was really thrown together at the last minute, and I'd like to thank God for putting each and every one of you in this space to hear these wonderful tales. Like Mimi said, it is impossible to follow Daryl Davis, but the reason that I wanted to have the dynamic that is set up here today when we were talking with Jake about who would speak and how we would confront this issue is because this is about empowering the voiceless. Right? It's giving a voice to the voiceless, and that is actually the solution, not just for those of us that are doing good work, but this is the reason why people that are doing bad work turn toward doing bad work, because they feel like they have no voice. And so in my own personal narrative, the small thing that I would like to say as if I planned for this one, but we'll just see where it goes, is that I think a concentration on how I became what I once was and how I am today, right, is largely dependent upon the fact of whether or not other people that were in the room were willing to hear me and were willing to recognize that I was there. And we have to learn how it's really easy to listen to Daryl Davis, and he's an amazing human being, and Mimi, they're amazing human beings, and it's really easy to listen to them and stand and applause and feel good when we go home. But on the way home, what do we miss out on? Who do we miss? And I think that's the key and the shift that we need. And so from there, my name is Jesse Morton, but I went by the name Yunus Abdullah Muhammad for a very long time in my life. I was not born a Muslim. Yunus Abdullah Muhammad is a name that's taken from Jonah. Yunus, Jonah, swallowed by the whale and spit back out. He ignored the message of God, and then he went on to call the people of Nineveh to God and was successful in the long run, but had to experience that trauma first. And Abdullah is the slave of God, one position that as a Muslim we try to find ourselves in, and Muhammad is for us a person who prays and worthy of worship. I knew nothing about any of this language or terminology or these ideas because I was born in a family in Pennsylvania, and I should have by all accounts been an all-American boy, if you will. My father was from New Jersey. His father was set to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in the United States. My father's side is incredibly affluent. I'm a descendant of John Adams, comeback American sons and daughters of the American Revolution, and my lineage is strong on my father's side, but during his senior year of high school, his father passed away out of nowhere, and my father had what you call a cognitive opening or experience that set him off as a searcher or a seeker in the context of a countercultural era where everyone was trying to find themselves and figure out which direction we were going to go. We knew we needed a break from the past, that the status quo was dying. And in some ways we found solutions, right? My father decided instead that he would become a beatnik and move to rural Pennsylvania, where he would attend a college called Susquehanna University, as if he was going to study liberal degree but not go on to law school, and instead what he did was he met a local, rural, low-class girl, and in those days when you impregnated someone, you tried to marry no matter what, no matter how early on in the relationship it was, and so they tried to get into a marriage, and I was born into a situation that was okay, probably, but I don't remember it being okay, but it was okay for several months until my father started to become a workaholic, became a local construction worker and building, Pennsylvania construction, and found his mistress and started to stay out at night. And I remember when I was young, and I was really maybe 9 years old, it suddenly hit me because things were starting to happen at home. My father was never there, and my mother was enraged, and she was angry, and she was infuriated, and she would grab me and she would pull my hair. My earliest memory is the light coming in. We lived in this old, dilapidated farmhouse, more than 200 years old, and the light would come in through the window, it would shine on my face, and my mother was choking me and spitting in my mouth and pulling my hair. It's the earliest memory that I have. I still wake up to it frequently. Not to say that it's a justification or a rationalization for who I become, but to say that that's the beginning of that shattering and that fracturing, because what I ended up growing up in is a situation that was very difficult because we were out in the hills. My father had become a beatnik, sort of counterculturalist, so we grew marijuana in the woodshed and dried it, and he sold it in town and pretended to be a construction worker, and we grew organic fruit in the garden, so he wanted it to be the hippie way. Bob Dylan, Grateful Dead, and all of these wonderful 1960s counterculturalists on the album shelf and on the bookshelf, all the wonderful works be here now, but nothing like that existed in my house. It was all just rhetoric, spaz, right? And so my mother, when Dad would leave, would call me into the house to take my regular beatings, and all day long I lived with her on top of me, spitting on me, choking me, pulling me, punching me, biting me, kicking me. And every once in a while, Dad would be called to come home, take his bad son home with him to work, and he would take me to my mother's mother, and he would show her, pull down my pants, and I would have bite marks up the inside of my thigh. And my grandmother used to sit with me, and she used to not want to get her daughter in trouble because abuse perpetuates, and we don't know where the trauma begins, and the cycle begins itself. But Grandma would say, "Stay strong, Jesse. It's gonna be okay someday. Stay strong. I believe in you. You can deal with this." But the truth is, I couldn't. At the age, and after asking society to help me in ninth grade, I went to a guidance counselor, and I asked the guidance counselor, I told the guidance counselor, I said, "My mom's beating me at home. I can barely talk in class." He called my mother in after school, and she came, and she said, "He fought with his brother over the weekend. He's kind of a bad kid," because of course I was acting out at school, so I was already labeled, right? And my mother talked her way out of that. Another year or so went by, I started smoking marijuana. I fulfilled the prophecy. She told me I was never going to amount to much. She told me I was using drugs before I was actually using them. At the age of 16, I took off. And I left home. I figured I'd go find my other side of the family's roots. So I went to, my dad's from Cranford, New Jersey, and I took the New Jersey Transit in, and I ended up behind Port Authority at a drop-in center called the Open Door in downtown Manhattan, and I lived there, and I learned how to live on the streets. I learned how to peddle dope, and I learned how to hustle, and then as I learned the streets, I learned how to survive, but I was traumatized. The whole time shaking because the person that had developed from a man who had learned how to protect his sister from getting abused, I developed a messianic sort of sense of wanting to sacrifice myself for a greater cause, but I was old and developed, but I didn't know. I knew how to give good advice and how to care and how to hope and how to love others, but I didn't have any clue how to do it for myself, so I would walk around giving and giving and giving, and I was homeless. Hustling to give to others, and just this was a characteristic that was always inside of myself, and one day the hippies came to Madison Square Garden, and the Grateful Dead was going to play. And I decided that I had found a counterculture that I too could believe in. Music was my therapy. And I traveled around and I listened to concert, and I traveled like a hippie, but I also started to sell drugs in their parking lots in order to get by. And one day I was arrested in State College, Pennsylvania. I read, the guard comes to this cell and he says, "First day in jail. Do you want to go to the law library? Do you want to go to the library and get a book?" I say yes. He takes me to the basement of an old dilapidated county jail, and I can't find anything but Westerners. I can't find anything but just donated books that nobody would really want or want to read particularly. But I find one book that is of appeal, and it's the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And when I got back to the cell, I fell in love. this was someone that was me, and this book was speaking to me. But I wondered as I get through it, like, why do I can relate. I don't like white people much either. I can feel the anger. I feel betrayed. I can't relate with my own people. I don't understand what to think or say or do. So this is appealing to me, but I don't know the solution, because the white man is now the devil. But then Malcolm goes to Mecca. And he says, I walked and circumambulated around the Kaaba with people that were white-skinned with blue eyes, and I felt the brotherhood, and Elijah Muhammad, he lied to me. And he comes back, and like a true seeker, says I was wrong. And I wish that he had gotten to live longer, because I know that the lessons he was starting to learn at the end of his life would have transformed his message that we now interpret into one of radical activism, but one that had learned and progressed and evolved. But the part that I remember was Malcolm, radical activist, traumatized kid, raised in white schools, ends up going on the streets. I had so many similarities. Going to jail, transforms his life and finds Islam. So I started, when I went back out and started to travel around with hippies again and hustle in downtown cities all over this country and do whatever I could do to get by as a street kid, I started to think about religion, because when they would tell me about Jesus and God, and people would always pick me up, but I always believed in God. I just didn't believe in no organized religion to tell me what to do, because I was a little bit rebellious. But when I started to read about Islam and all of these religions, I started to find something that was of interest to me. And one day I was in Philadelphia, and it was towards the end of what seemed to be winding down. Life was getting messed up. I was using heroin. I was starting to use cocaine. I was using almost everything I could melt into a spoon. And I'm walking around in the streets, and I meet in Philadelphia, there's a large fundamentalist Saudi Arabian influenced Muslim community. They call them Salafis. They study over in Saudi Arabia, they come back, they're very strict, and they actually do a lot of wonderful work, but a lot of the people take that in jail, come home and try to sustain it, but can't. So there was this brother, his name was Shakur, and he was downtown on 13th Street, South Street, and Broad, where the hustlers hang out in Philadelphia, and I was selling ecstasy and he was selling dope and blah, blah, blah. We ended up hanging out and going up to North Philly. We're coming out of the hood. We had a corporate exec, stuck in a hotel room, making us go run for him, and we're serving him and blah, blah, blah. We get out of the hood and they say, lay down, pop, 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 lights on. I don't know this is not what we do. We run, me and Shakur, we run into what they call in North Philly an abandonment, and we stay behind the drywall, so to say, and we're hiding out, and he says, just say these words after me and everything will be okay. And he repeats in Arabic what means I bear witness that there's only one God and that the Prophet Muhammad is the last and final messenger of God. I have no clue what he's saying. Ashhadu an la ilaha, but I want to get out of trouble, and we do. The police never got us. So in the morning, we creep down the stairs of the abandonment, and we get in the first cab, and he says, I'm gonna take you to my wife's house. Now for me, this is a sign. He takes me to his wife's house, and he says, just tell her you converted to Islam, she'll let you in. So I knock on, hi, I'm converted to Islam. He says, his name's Muhammad. He says, oh, welcome, brother. So happy for you. And welcomes me in and cooks me a meal and gives me a safe space and a place to sleep. And I go to sleep on the couch, and I wake up in the morning and go into the bathroom and I read the Quran, and I pick up the book, and it says, this is the first line of the Quran after we opening chapter. This is a book wherein there's no doubt, a guidance for people of consciousness. And I start to read it, and I get overtaken with this feeling of there's a spiritual presence in the room. My trauma is just wanting to die. It wants to stop. I've spent my entire life trying to get it to stop. And it felt for a moment like it had stopped. And so when he woke up, I told him I wanted to convert. He said, you can convert, I'll take you to the mosque. It's good you want to become a Muslim, but you can't stay here, you gotta go. So I stowed away from Philadelphia to DC, and from DC to Richmond on a bus, Greyhound. Used to be, you could go back to 13th and Fulton and just get on the bus, and they would never check the tickets, so you were good. Different world, pre-9/11. So I end up in Richmond to see what's called like a hippie concert, right? At VCU. And I had thrown all my money away, and I pulled out this old hustle. We used to buy these little Anisons, they're aspirins, and call them ecstasy, double-stacked Czechoslovakian, and sell them to concert goers for $20 a piece, so turn the $10.99 bottle of aspirin into $2,000 by ripping people off. But I ripped off an undercover cop, and so I got incarcerated and went to jail. And it was actually in Richmond City Jail that I was radicalized, because the only thing I knew as a person who didn't have an address in Richmond to get bond was that I was about to get thrown onto a cell block full of 40 people that didn't know where I was from, that I did not resemble their color of skin, because it's very true, the majority of people in county jails are certainly minorities, and they're disproportionately represented, and I can tell you that for a fact. So I'm about to go in this cell block. I have a mattress, I have dreadlocks down in one on my back, and they throw me in the cell block, and this guy, Hassan, is sitting there, and I say, brother, I'm a Muslim. So he gives me a bed to lay my rack on. Now, Hassan was an interesting individual because he was Moroccan, but he had traveled to fight on behalf of the Afghan-Soviet jihad. And so Hassan had come back, but he had a little angry streak, and he had gotten into some trouble and had gotten into a fight on Richmond streets, and he was incarcerated without any bond because, for whatever reason. He taught me how to pray in Arabic, he taught me the Quran, he taught me all the rules of my newfound religion, and then he told me one day, go in the shower and wash, and I will give you a new identity. I'm going to give you a new name, your Muslim name. And when you wash every inch of your body and you make what they call ghusl in Arabic, you're going to come out and you're going to be born new, because when you first convert to Islam, all of your sins are forgiven if you weren't born as a Muslim. So you're totally absolved. You're starting a new life. I was like, where is the shower? Send me there. I scrubbed, I cried, I was so ready, I was so excited. And I came out and they had the sheets laid out in the jailhouse full of white. They had the Quran open for me to pledge my actual belief to. And he said, and now I give you your new name after I bear witness that I believe in the religion. Your name is Yunus. Jonah in the Bible was spit out by the whale. You spent your entire life running from God, but all of that pain was worth it. Now you need to call the people to it. And you're a slave of God, nothing more. Never forget that. Everything that happens to you comes from God alone. And Muhammad is his last and final messenger. And you have to emulate him in everything you do, including how you use the bathroom. So your religion has an answer for every question that you may have. Men, talk about a traumatized kid that needs guidance, that has no family. That being given the first form of family and support in a jail, right? And is also being sent on a mission to call to this religion in the world. So a couple of days go by and we're praying and he's leading the prayer, and this Christian gets upset in the jailhouse because if you call the Adhan, when you call prayer, Allahu Akbar, you say it loud. So he wakes the Christian up and he comes and he stands in front of us praying, and Hassan is leading the prayer. And the Christian will not move. So he tries to move him, but he doesn't move. So he gets up and he starts punching him. And he gets beat up really bad. So he's back in the back of the cell block in a bed. And I don't understand. Because for me, religion was about peace, completely. I didn't get it. And he explains to me that there's a narration that is attributed to the Prophet Muhammad where the Prophet literally said, if someone comes and stands in front of the prayer, gently move them to the right with your hand. But if they don't move and they continue to stand there, then stand up and fight them, for verily they are a devil. And he fulfills this to the T. But then he also explains to me that the reason that we fall, I say, you're so small, like compared to him, you got beat up and all of his homies could have really jumped you. And he says to me, this is the way of Islam. We're David fighting Goliath. Right? It's what we do. It's always been this way. Now, this is not to say that the religion of Islam is in any way, shape, or form supportive of what I would become, but this is what I started to see. This is the way that I, as a traumatized brain, is interpreting something that is firm and started to explore and frame it into a political lens, because he tells me about an end of times prophecy where the black flag will be raised in Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, and it will not be stopped until it reaches Jerusalem. And I was a far leftist anarchist while I was a hippie. So this fulfilled all of my readings on Chomsky and Finkelstein and all of the far left with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I can play a role in that too. I'm Malcolm. I can go get and become Malcolm now. Because as soon as those drugs come back from the lab, I'm going home. And I did. And my story is long and detailed from that. I went to Syracuse Salvation Army and I started a complete new life. I walked out of Richmond City Jail. The only place I could find was Syracuse, New York. They gave me a bed, they gave me a shelter, they let me stay there. And I totally dropped everything. Drugs, lifestyle, everything. And I became a very firm and serious Muslim. And then 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, George Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And I didn't feel like nobody in the United States gave a flying rat's ass about me. And so I joined the terrorists. And a white kid with blue eyes started preaching on 125th Street in Harlem, speaking out against the Iraq War. Thought I was a radical activist. I was walking the same streets as Malcolm. I was living with the same people he knew. I was literally living in a shelter that was run by his old cohorts and the son of Elijah Muhammad himself. And then I met a group one year at the Muslim Day Parade, which is an annual day parade in New York City. The group was called the Islamic Thinkers Society. I realized that it was largely an oxymoron now, but I ended up joining this group when they belonged to the largest radical recruitment agency in the United Kingdom. And I've always been somewhat articulate and intelligent, so I learned this philosophy, this ideology inside out, and I began to preach it and teach it. And when Al-Qaeda started to lose ground after the invasion of Iraq, they told us that wherever you are, convey the ideology, because ideas are eternal. They can kill us, but our ideas live on. So convey our ideology. But I was in America. So what you can get tortured for in the Middle East, I can say all day long in public. And so I did it. I took Al-Qaeda's message that was crafted with hour-and-a-half long diatribes in poorly filmed videos. We used to say in caves, now we know in compounds and about it, and I translated them so that they appealed to young people that were now migrating to utilize new platforms online. They were using these new things we didn't know what they were. They were called YouTube. They were called Facebook and MySpace, if anyone remembers. And people are starting to develop this new world of decentralized social media communication. And for terrorists, it's great because we don't need to get in the mainstream media anymore, right? And I helped create an ecosystemic approach to promoting the terrorist ideology of extremism that largely set a template upon which we saw become rampant and viral during the age of ISIS. It did not start. In many ways, the reason that ISIS had so much influence in the West is because of what my cohorts did, in that we set forth a process, we set forth the seed, we planted the seeds of the ideology, and we did so in a manner that set up the infrastructure online so that anyone, anywhere, could access the message of Osama bin Laden. And we did it so that it looked just like it was from Hollywood or Madison Avenue. We designed glossy English language jihadi magazines that ricocheted around the world. We threatened the writers of South Park when they would portray or claim to portray the Prophet Muhammad, and we used that to get in the media and to get publicity. And so immediately where you think you're shedding light on, but all the whole time through my process, I started my de-radicalization in 2011. The whole time through my process, I promise you that one thing is true. If the right person in the right space just would have came to me and gave me a hug, I would have stopped. I just wanted to be heard. I just wanted someone to recognize me. And they did. I lived 2 lives. At the same time I was becoming Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, Jesse Morgan was able to slip in and get a scholarship to go to undergraduate school in New York City, school called Metropolitan College in New York. I became a certified alcohol and substance abuse counselor. I ran a nonprofit organization in Brooklyn, New York, clandestinely while I was this other guy on the side. He was my alter ego. And eventually, I went on to get a graduate degree from Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. And now today, long story short, in 2011, I started to change. I went to jail ultimately. I spent 3 years and 8 months in a federal correctional institute. The person that researched and investigated me for 5 years of his life, the former director of intelligence at the NYPD, is now my partner. Because when I got finally the opportunity to meet all those that I had claimed conspiratorially were plotting against my religion, and I realized that the only thing that they wanted to do in the law enforcement community was make sure that innocent people like the people that are sitting here right now did not get massacred and killed. They had the courage and the understanding to actually work with me and to listen to me as I told them that there's alternatives to simply solving this problem with bullets and bombs, and they gave me an opportunity. And I was released having been originally sentenced 11 and a half years in prison. And I did 3 years and 8 months, and I came home March 2015. March 1st, 2015, I came home in the midst of an icy scandal and an icy scare from the Federal Correctional Institute. There was never no program. They never planned one of the earliest terrorism-related releasees to return to America's streets. And I came home and I worked as an analyst for the FBI, and I worked advising the Obama administration on how to counter violent extremism, and I did the best I could behind closed doors to put together a broken life when I thought it was all over. And one of the things that happened was people that were close to me had reached out, and we utilized my ability to access. I knew all the big names that are in all of the books were my cohorts, my colleagues, my accomplices. And so when they reached out to tell me that they were happy I was home, and when it didn't hit the press that I had gotten a sentence reduction, I was right back intermixing with my old networks, but this time I was working on behalf of the FBI, and there was 2 kids in Virginia that were gonna behead someone if they didn't get to travel to Syria soon. And the case was thwarted because they trusted me enough to ask if I would build a bridge. And a young Washington Post journalist, defense attorney at the bond hearing says, "Your Honor, they're using a former jihadist in a conspiracy against my client." And the judge strikes it from the record and says, "If you say that one more time, because you don't even know who the confidential informant is till you get to trial," and they never go to trial because they're guilty as sin. The conspiracy theorists on the internet love to talk and chatter. And so they outed me. The Washington Post reporter outed me, and I was already having a hard enough time. FBI calls, says, "You gotta move," and then they dropped me. And I didn't know what to do. So long story short, I went on to become America's very first former jihadist. And now I have, after falling apart and returning to my trauma temporarily and learning that relapse is a part of recovery, I have put together an amazing organization with the co-founder of my organization now called Mitch Silver, and we put together beautiful people like Daryl Davis and Mimi, and we're trying at a nationwide level, but also whatever we can do, to put together a formal organization that can work to do and hold these kinds of conversations. And the ultimate message at the end of the day is that we all have a story, right? And we need to use our stories and our narratives in ways that we can start to get around the culture, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what it's the neo-Nazis, the jihadists, the far left, it doesn't matter who your enemy is. We have a poisoned, sick, and diseased cultural ethos that is the real problem. You want to know why Islam appealed to me and the religion of jihadism appealed to me? For the first time in my life, I was put on the lap of a man and held and hugged. I was taught to seek knowledge, not to watch dumb TV shows and think that life was all about shopping and consumerism. I was taught to think about why I was here on this earth and what my meaning was, what my purpose was. And I was taught to care. And I was taught that people of all colors and cultures and tongues were designed and created by God in order to travel around and get to know one another. Yet I came from a country that is plagued with a long history of white supremacist racism. We don't have that problem. And so it appealed. In the same way that were I born in another era, a different extremist ideology could have appealed to me. And so I am really honored, and I respect the fact that you guys have come and listened. Everyone here could stand up on this space, and I'm so glad that Mimi said that. We all have a narrative. The only way that we can have time to tell it and to hear others, right, is if we can understand that it's not going to get anything from a 30-second YouTube clip, or if we're stuck and addicted to our phones. We have to get out. We have to take time, we have to get to know one another, we have to have those uncomfortable conversations. Right now I work with neo-Nazis, jihadists, people that are considered the worst of the worst. And I'll tell you one thing, I talk to them every day and we work with them every day, and we don't get paid for it. We do it tirelessly, right? And we try to promote these messages, and they're all human beings. And all they want is to be heard. It's all anybody wants, is to be heard. So thank you for hearing me, and turn it.
been really gracious, including Joel and Richmond Hill, but there's some time for some questions for Mimi and for Jesse. If people have been inspired to probe further. Yeah, question here?
Yes, Jesse, you continue to work with Andy No, who is actively engaging with violent fascists who are attacking people on the streets of Portland, who's privy to the planning of the attacks at Cedar Riot in Portland. Andy No stood by and watched this, and you continue to work with him. How can you justify this when you're saying that you come from a past where you've lived two lives? One was living a glossy undergrad life, where the other one was working to create propaganda for Islamists. Is this not the same, where you're helping to create fascist propaganda?
The question is justifying the relationship
With Andy No, yes. What do you mean I work with Andy No?
You said this on Sunday, that you had no apologies for working alongside with him. You helped.
I said I have no apologies for calling Andy No a nice guy. Have you met Andy No? Do you think Andy No supports Atomwaffen? Like you guys claim? When you hold a billboard...
I did not say Atomwaffen.
Excuse me, you asked me a question. I will answer your question. This is not your space, and I think it's incredibly rude that you would come here as a gotcha moment when we're trying to have a spiritual conversation that has nothing to do with these tit for tats.
No.
So you know what, actually, I'm not even going to answer your question. If you want me to answer your question, we'll do it outside.
No, well, you're just rejecting me because I'm asking something you don't like?
Okay, I'll answer very quickly.
I thought we talk offline.
Exactly.
So
This is offline.
It's not. There's a lot of lines right
We have a limited time, and this is not of primary importance.
This is the importance of my friends that you're going after.
Okay.
You told Molly Conger to live by the sword. You are going after Andy No. Docks a woman who was hit in the spine, fractured vertebrae, and you continue to say he's a good guy. And you're now telling me that you don't even want to talk to me about this right now.
No, not right now, because these people have questions, and this is not the topic. This takes an hour to go through, and I will go through it with you right after this is over. Yeah. I will give you more of my time right after this is over. I'm asking you right now to respect this space is not the space for this. You did it to Daryl, and you're doing it here. You have to stop this. It's insanity. I'm not your enemy.
Why are you calling me insane?
All right, we'll do this later, all right? All right, thank you.
These are personal attacks against me.
Excuse me. Okay. I appreciate you wanting to be in a righteous space. I do. But what you're doing counters exactly what they were trying to do. They're saying we need to talk. We don't need to argue. Everyone makes mistakes. There's not one person here who has not done something that they would be appalled at if it was exposed. So, be willing to listen. Be willing to be wrong. Be willing to accept that people can change. Because what you're doing is not helpful. It's not helpful. Now, if you want to talk to him, I would love to see you talk to him, not argue. Okay. Excuse me.
I want to correct
you. So if you want to make a point with him, and it's a personal point, this is not the place.
Exactly.
And so we're asking you to hold your tongue and wait until everyone else has an opportunity to ask the questions that they came to ask or that have evolved from listening. And then you can have your moment. But that's not fair.
I'm not looking for my moment.
It's
I'm
not
looking for
fair.
an answer as to why he's working with someone who's actively trying to hurt their friends.
You have an agenda,
I will give it to
and
you.
you're not willing to listen.
We will do it one-on-one in private.
If you've ever heard of amygdala hijack, where you can't hear people when you're all upset, that's where you are.
You can talk to me
So I'm
anytime
telling
you
you
want
now,
on Twitter.
just calm yourself down.
I did, and you said live by the sword, die by the sword.
Excuse me. Just calm yourself down. There are people here who are willing to help you all have a conversation, but this is not the place. I want to thank you all for what you're doing. I'm doing work that's trying to get people to talk, and it's hard to do, but keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. God bless you. Let's just move past that, and I will talk to you after the
I doubt it.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much.
I don't think I have a question. I'm grateful for your work. both of you and Daryl's. I also do trauma work, and what I've had to come to so that I'm not angry with the people who have perpetuated trauma on my people is to understand that we have to have hard conversations, but we have to have them in the right spaces. Because everybody's not ready for the conversation, and everybody's not ready to be a hearer because they assume that they have more to say than hear. And so I want to thank you all for being willing to be put in these positions and to tell your truth. Because the Word of God says, nowhere else in the Bible can I find it except in John, that the truth is what's going to set us free. And so telling your truth gives me permission to tell mine. And so thank you all for the work that you're doing, and know that you're being held up in prayer, and that one day I hope that I will get to work with you.
And I want to say real briefly that we are all about like finding opportunities. I live in Northern Virginia, Mimi lives in DC, Daryl lives in Silver Spring, and there's an open invitation for anyone that wants to talk with us, because we're all doing things, and this is the most amazing thing. But the problem is we create space free of hate, right? But the like-minded always are the ones that come to participate and to enjoy this. We have to take this to those that don't have it, and that's what we need to formulate partnerships.
I think the comment that Lady gave here is a good wrap-up.
Yeah.
We're already over time.
We're over time.
Jesse has indicated that he's willing to talk to people elsewhere. If nearby, there's a restaurant nearby or outside. I don't know what Richmond Hill's time frames allow. But we do need to wrap up, and Joel's going to actually come and kind of close things on a quiet note, a reflective note, if that's still the plan. I did want to say, sorry.
I just want to say real quick, one of the things that we do is we counter narrative jihadists and the far right wing extremists, and we publish these magazines. They are online e-zines, but we print them in display, and some of the copies of them are over there. And if there's any way that you can make a donation in order so that we can continue to print them, so that we can continue to do these speeches, if you're interested, the magazine includes a narrative of over 10 different former extremists that are affiliated with the organization, giving you their background, and some of those that we pulled out of the movement. So it gives you a very vivid, first-hand account. So if possible, back there, my sons, Zubair and Abdul Haq, will accommodate the distribution of those. And we'll be going across the street, I believe, I'll meet out front in the parking lot. And if anyone wants to continue the discourse, we can go to the coffee shop down the road.
When we Google search, that's one. And then second thing is, it appears from witnessing this discussion that we need to have our like South Africa reconciliation moment on a national level, which I see you all doing organically. But I think that is going to, we're not going to have true healing in our country until we actually face that.
You're absolutely right.
As a country.
And that's the long term, right? We need to get these conversations going. We have a website called lightUponLight.online. LightUponLight.online. It's in the magazine and on the papers that we'll hand out afterwards. But you can literally, it's easy to just Google my name or Parallel Networks, and you can find the contact information that way too. I'd love to hear from each and every single one of you to see what we can do together. Thank you guys so much for
Joel, I just want to thank you again, and you all, Mimi and Jesse and Daryl, for being so vulnerable and sharing wounds with all of us. And I would just hope that as we do reflect and go into the weekend and the uncertainty of Monday, that we do keep in mind that they've left their mark here in Richmond now with us. And Jesse has some previous marks in Richmond, so there's an interesting full circle here. But no, we're now in a relationship, and they have vast networks globally. We have individual relational networks that are now in connection. So just reflect on that there's an exponential increase in the networks that we now have, and the influence and the solidarity and the sharing of symbols. So hopefully that's a boost of hope and more power and influence as we head into the weekend. Thank you again, Joel. Please.
So Mimi and Jesse, thank you, and Daryl. And it's been our pleasure to host you this afternoon. We appreciate the work that you're doing. And just to close this time, I want to invite us into a few moments of silence and invite you to hold this state and our city in Capitol Hill in your thoughts and in your prayers, and then I'll offer a few words just to close. Grant us an ease to breathe deeply of this moment, this light, this miracle of now. Beneath the din and fury of great movements and harsh news and urgent crises, make us attentive still to good news, to small occasions, and the grace of what is possible for us to be and to do, to give, to receive, that we may miss neither our neighbor's gift nor our enemy's need. Grant us a sense of humor that adds perspective to compassion, gratitude that adds persistence to courage, quietness of spirit that adds irrepressibility to hope, openness of mind that adds surprise to joy. Open our eyes and our ears with the summons to follow to something more of justice and of joy. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Jake.